Good day, this is Pico Pie, and I am doing a writing podcast with some of my friends from the School for New Writers. How about you all introduce yourself, starting with Dark Lord Comp?
Hey guys, I'm Dark Lord Comp. I've been on Fanfic for a while, and I'm just happy that we get to do this actually. So,
I'm Morning Zephyr. I'm well, people over at the School for New Writers will know that I'm an admin there, and I'm also a writer, and I was formerly a pre-reader for Equestria Daily. And I just like talking about writing and know a good amount about it.
I'm Piercing Sight. I've been Brony since like the beginning of the fandom, but I joined Fanfiction just like over a year ago to kind of get some of my fix out, read some other stuff from other writers. Turns out I ended up getting very involved in that, and so here I am.
And I'm Pico Pie. I've done some head of writing tracks for Everfree Northwest. I pre-read and edit for other people, including the story Cry for Eternity, which has almost 30,000 views right now, and I write myself. So we're going to start off here with, we have some questions from the School for New Writers, and we're going to start off with Morning Zephyr's questions that he's going to be answering for us first because he's on a little bit of a time constraint. So how about you start us off, Morning?
Well, so the format for answering these questions is that we decided that every person would have certain questions that they would answer on their own so that people don't talk over each other and the question can be answered in full. Then after that, we'll have discussion with everyone, and it will probably be chaos.
Glorious chaos.
Yep.
Go ahead and read the questions, Dark.
Okay. So, Lily Days asks, how do you make characters more realistic?
This question is not that simple, but the first thing to understand is that realistic doesn't mean good. Like, if you look at people in real life, there are a lot of really, really, really boring people where it's just a chore to be around them and talk to them. The first thing you have to ask yourself is, how well does being realistic serve them in the story? And you need to know what their role in the story is. It really depends on your preferences as a writer, because both sides have their own goods and bads. Like, some of the most famous and beloved characters aren't realistic whatsoever. A whole lot of really, really popular villains, such as Discord, aren't really realistic because people don't act like that. But if you are dead set on making a realistic character, then what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to get into the mundane. You're going to have to go to the stuff that isn't actually very interesting to think about. First of all, you probably want to give them some form of hobby. Pretty much everyone has one of these. Like, for example, I had a character who just liked to make carvings, and that was what they liked. They weren't good at it. It never went anywhere, but they liked it, and they like to tell people about it. And so you can add things, but also you need to ask, like, how is that character normal? Like, what parts of them just would you expect in normal people, and how would you show them in the story over the course of it to make them seem more realistic? And so you also want to, like, give them things that they like that are completely mundane. Anything from, like, say, a sport to just like a particular food or something would work. And you also want to shift the way you're thinking about these characters, because if you've made a lot of characters in writing, you're probably thinking very specific ways. Like, I know I tend to think of a character as the way that they speak, which isn't really how you define people. You define people by both how they speak, how they act, and how they think. And so you want to just imagine them in day-to-day situations. Try to come up with one and see, like, figure out how they would respond to those, how they would act during those. Another important thing about realistic characters is that they have contradicting opinions and feelings. This is known as cognitive dissonance. You will find this in pretty much any real person, and it's where they have one feeling that contradicts another, that it just doesn't make sense. Like, you say, it's like, oh, I like this, but also I don't. And you just have to think about the ways that they have that and make them come through in the story, because if you're making a realistic character, you have to actually show it. You can't just have them be that way and never show it, because it's not really that interesting. That's what I have to say. On to discussion.
Well, there's something I think that you mentioned very early on that was really good, and that's that you're talking about how you don't necessarily... you kind of mentioned how you don't necessarily have to make every character realistic. I think that that's kind of important for a lot of writers, especially if you're newer, because trying to make every character perfect can be really hard.
Superman!
Oh god, don't. I hate Superman so much. Oh my god.
Crap.
Oh yeah, you know, the character that I have never found a person who like genuinely likes Superman as a character.
Well,
The only story,
I mean, as a character, not his powers, not his.
the only
He's
story,
not anything
the
around him. Him himself.
the only story on Fanfic that has actually made me like Superman was when they when they call or whatever by I forget his name. That story actually made me like Superman, and it was just not because of Superman.
Okay,
Yeah.
before we get sidetracked, as we always
Yes.
do whenever
Yeah.
we talk.
So, you also mentioned how, adding in little things like a sport or something helps people relate. That's a big key with making people feel real, but the big challenge with that is making it apply to a lot of people. So I'm not a sports guy. I mean, I used to play sports, but it's just not something that it's big in my life. So if someone adds a sports aspect to a character, I'm not going to relate to it. But if it's a big motivation in the character, it's a big part of the story, doing that well will still help connect. But a lot of times it's one or two little things, little quirks, because people understand quirks a little bit more often, even if they don't have it themselves. They're used to knowing people that have quirks, like maybe it's an eye twitch, or maybe it's, how they always, say or something like that. Certain things like that can help relate to other people that they know, and you'll see, especially like even in professional books, different target audiences will have certain different things. Speaking of Superman, when the Supergirl movie trailer for the TV show came out and her heel breaks, that's a very common thing amongst women-focused comedies, where it's it's the strong female character, but she's kind of down on her luck right now, and oh look, her heel broke, because to that audience, that's something that a lot of the audience will relate to. So when you're picking these traits, keep in mind what your audience is, and it'll help it be more effective, because you can make a really realistic character, but if it's not the type of things that people who are reading your story are used to, they'll still have trouble relating.
And I think I realized something I should have mentioned, because I don't know how I forgot this. An important thing is their reactions to things, because in the typical story, a lot of really weird stuff is going to happen, and I don't know. So depending on whoever's listening to this, if you've ever played video games, you'll know that most characters don't react realistically whatsoever. You'll have this character that's oh, super scared, and then this monster comes at them, and they don't comment on it because we're not in a cutscene right now. And
in Halo.
then later on, they see that same monster, and they're like, "Oh no, what's that thing? It's coming at me!" And you're like, "We just attacked that thing and killed it 5 minutes ago." So it's important to make your character's reactions not character, make them person.
And changing those reactions as the character grows is one of the great ways to show growth as well.
Yeah, it's like how in Mass Effect, a good example with Mass Effect actually is whenever Commander, at least for the last 5 times, whenever Commander Shepard sees a Reaper, he's like, oh, fudge. So, and before I stop, going back to the Supergirl thing, that also is a very good way to show character development with Supergirl, because most Supergirl's age in the time frame for the show that they're making tend to not have the problem of breaking heels that often, but they could use that as a character development thing, since Supergirl is still new to her powers, it shows her having trouble with her powers in a believable way, instead of flicking a building and the building falling over kind of thing.
It also becomes a self-fulfilling, cliche, quote, it's a cliche because it's done so much that everyone knows about it. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing if it's done well, because...
Hey, that's the next question. Don't step on my...
Oh, is that the next question? Oh, well,
You want me to go to the next question?
shut up then.
Oh,
Oh, let's give Piercing a chance.
Yeah, Pierce.
oh yeah, I need to say something now.
No, you don't.
Anyway, but like as Morning Zephyr was saying, it's like you have these realistic characters, and depending on their position in their in the story, you have to address their realism very differently. Like if you're going to just have them be like some sort of background character, some side character, like a waiter at a restaurant, waiter at a restaurant or something, then you're going to have them just like take the order and walk away. And if like someone makes conversation with them, it's not going to be very interesting. It's just going to be a character that's there to perform one act and then disappear and never pop up in the story again. But if you're going to have a character that's going to be like the main character, but you want them to be realistic, again, going back to the, like if they have an interest or a hobby or something, if they've got things that people don't normally relate to, introduce the character, introduce the reader to those things through the eyes of the character. It's like, oh, I love the example of sports. I love sports so much. And then you have to explain, or not explain, but like go through the experience of the character with the reader so that the reader can see how excited they get and what their dreams are and what their hopes are. And that helps the reader to connect to the character a lot better, even if it's realistically something that they wouldn't normally connect with.
You also touched on something else there. If you're trying to make a different character more relatable and you have the side character who comes in, they're just taking an order, if you add in something little to that character and you show how your main character picks up on that, it also helps them be relatable. Because when you see, if you see someone fall, it gets back to reaction, that whole reaction thing. Well, if you're reacting to a real person, it can help as well. That might be something for a little bit more advanced writers. Yeah. But if you're able to make a character who's only in for a few paragraphs seem realistic and have your reactions to them, relate to your readers, that'll go a long way. And it's something that is more advanced, but it's also something that's a little bit more subtle. So it's a little bit less cliche for a lot of things.
Also, like a stallion leaves a large tip and the waitress blushes or something.
It's important to remember that these things will generally take more time. That's the big reason why realistic doesn't mean better, is because some of these things might bore the reader. Like, I know Pika was like, you shouldn't really...
Are you saying it might mess with the flow? Which is one of the later questions.
It might mess with the flow. It might also just not be interesting.
On a side note, as a person, how big of a tip are you leaving? That the waitress will actively blush when looking at you?
I don't know.
50 to 100%?
Dude, a tip that represents the size of
we're gonna have to censor that.
I asked for that.
I'm pretty sure most of the people watching this... well, I censored myself when I said fudge. I deserve one.
I think fudge represents something a little bit less problematic for a lot of people.
Segueing off of my cuss word, that's I think why My Little Pony tends to work a bit really well with its characters, because the characters aren't the most realistic, but they still are relatable. Like, there are still quirks that they have and that they do with at least the main six that you can relate to them. Twilight Sparkle being a bit OCD about certain things and loving books and loving to read.
The biggest thing about her is that she's socially awkward, which a lot of people can relate.
Also, the main reason why Twilight Sparkle is such a good character as an example for the realistic, you get to see her character progress from being socially awkward into the princess she becomes. And that's why the show is generally considered a really good show, because it's just so easy to my phone just went off. But it's generally considered really easy to relate to her because of how realistic she is compared to the rest of the cast. Pinkie Pie.
We should move on.
Yeah, I was about to say we should.
So moving on to the next question before we segue again, dihydrogen monoxide asks, in the idea-saturated world we live in now, how can one be truly original anymore? And if one cannot be original, how can one negotiate a cliche in a manner that still makes it interesting to the readers? And thank you for doing this. Aw, thank you, dihydrogen.
You're welcome. Okay, so first of all, the answer to your first question, you can't be original. This is just not up for debate. Like, because your entire life is composed of experiences that are like manufactured, and well, okay, that's a bit of a weird way to say it, but like, you see for most people, like most of the stuff you see is stuff that has already been either used or stuff that's been made by someone else. So like, what you're going to use a TV, that's not original. But also like, there's these so many different stories, not stories, articles and stuff. And like, I heard this from my English teacher in grade school. It's like that there are only a certain amount of conflicts, like man versus man or man versus society or whatever. Usually these have like some conflicting ones, and I'm not going to go into that because really, who cares how many there are and what they are? We're just here to write stories. Um, but so originality doesn't matter. Like, it really doesn't, because ideas don't really matter that much. Execution does. Um, the thing about ideas is that ideas affect you the most. Typically, like when you're talking about a story, like you want ideas that excite you, but if you do any idea right, there's always going to be a way that you can phrase it that will excite readers, potential readers. But as for the question about like negotiating the cliche, again, we have to talk back the same thing as the realistic characters. Cliche doesn't mean bad. Cliche just means something that a lot of stories do. And this happens for a reason. Like, for example, most stories have characters. We were talking about Warrior Cats, that freaking series yesterday, and I pointed out that, it's not actually about characters that act like cats. It's about cats that act like people. So you don't see any real stories that are about a cast that's entirely acting like actual animals,
My
and that's
Little
because
Pony is
no one
another
really
example.
cares for that. And also, for example, like if you go into the psychology stuff, like the hero's journey, it's the hero's journey is essentially all about how myths have a number of similarities in how the story goes, and that's simply because this way that the story goes is appealing to us on a base level. It appeals to everyone from any culture. So that's a lot of avoiding answering the question. But so for actually trying to avoid cliche, a good method is to simply look at what you would expect to happen if you were a reader at this point, and then go the opposite way. You can do this with characters, you can do this with events, you can do this with plot. It can be as big or as small as you want it to be. You can also, if you're still in the planning stage, you can take an old idea, something that's common, and put a spin on it. Like, for example, I'm a fan of adventure stories, and they're my favorite stories to write. And so I just had this one where it's like Cadence goes missing in a foreign place, and then Twilight is called upon to go get her. And, that's a very, very common kind of story construction, at least on Fanfic. Um, so what I did is that I then had Rainbow Dash was dead. Rainbow Dash had been killed a while ago, and pretty much the main six was gone. They're not adventuring anymore. Like, Twilight blames herself because it actually was her fault. And then when I actually like wrote the description for the story, I framed it as that being the main thing, and then the adventure story is just another part. It's where the story goes. But it then sounded original to people when I told it to them. And that's because it feels original, because it's just a spin. And this is back to the idea that there are only a certain amount of conflicts. It's because, like, there only are so many different ways that a story can go on a large scale. And interesting is really all about how you do it. It's about your execution. It's about how you make your execution different from other stories that have been about the same things.
And if you're done about originality too, whenever people say that Fallout Equestria or Past Sins were original in their idea, they really weren't.
Wait, people said that?
Well, a few people when it came out.
Well, keep in mind,
the main reason they're saying that is because they were so well written by the authors that they became overwhelmingly popular compared to what was coming out at the time. When I was on FimFic, when those two stories came out, or not FimFic, but when I was browsing
FTD.
Equestria Daily, the only way, before FimFic came out, the only way to really get your fanfiction fix was off of Equestria Daily. And Equestria Daily, I'm pretty sure Morning Zephyr can attest to this, is kind of hard on what gets in and what doesn't get in.
It's basically a minor publishing house for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, like literally being a pre-reader is almost exactly like being an editor, except that when you approve something, you don't actually have to help edit it or anything.
Yeah. And so with what a lot of people don't know, at least with the Fall of Equestria and Past Sins and the conversion bureaus, is before FimFic was a thing, that was the only way to get fan fiction, and it was so heavily screened that only like the quote-unquote best of the best got in.
And it was best of the best at the time. As time has gone by, they've gotten harder.
Quote unquote is a very important part of this.
FimFic is different because FimFiction, the moment that came out, I'm sorry to say, and I know this is going to sound mean, but a lot of garbage got put into the fandom on the base level, so you really had to dig. That's what generally happens when you
market
make it
got a bit.
Now,
remember, there was always fanfiction.net before that.
Yeah, but fanfiction. I'm going to browse this fanfiction.net for pony fanfictions that often.
I'm going to pull this back a bit back to the actual question, because we can get into the inner workings and politics of the Brony fandom, but that's not what the question is.
That was still kind of about the question, though, because I was saying Fall of Equestria may not seem original now, but you also have to realize that when it came out, it still wasn't original. It was done before. It just wasn't as popular because it was on websites.
So there's a few things to consider about this. One is that there will always be someone who hasn't run across something before. The reason why pop music has always been popular and will always be popular is because people will come to an age where they just started listening to music at a certain type of age, and that'll seem new and interesting to them, which is a huge thing for something to be popular. Is it's new and interesting but somewhat relatable. For a lot of people, that's pop music. They'll get into a band, and it's like, well, that's the same band that was popular 20 years ago, it's just different people. Well, yes, but to the new generation, they haven't heard that before. That's a big thing about being original, is it's not necessarily coming up with an idea that's never been done before. It's coming up with an idea that your target audience has not seen. The other thing that's Well, I have one more quick thing to add to that, and then I'll pretty much shut up for this question. If you're trying to come up with something original, keep asking questions. It's not just, should these two characters have a romance? It's, do these characters, when did they meet? Do they both start liking each other, at the same time, or did one like another, or is another character who pushed them together? By asking more questions, you get more specific. The more specific you are, the more original you seem. And when it comes to cliches, if most of everything is original and you have a little bit of cliche dialogue, keep in mind it's cliche for a reason. It's okay to have some cliche in a story because at some point in time, that was considered the thing to do because it worked well. And it might be overdone now, but as long as you have enough originality, a little bit of cliche isn't a bad thing, and it can really make your life as a writer easier because you don't need every single line to be completely original.
Yeah,
also,
so my 2 cents on
cliche,
this
people only hate cliche when it's either like predictable or like it's just stupid. Like, for example,
it doesn't have originality.
People only don't like this thing when it's bad.
When I was still reading Shipfix, there was this one thing that really pissed me off as a reader, and that was when they would just have one character be like, I want to kiss that person, and then they'd be like, huh, where did that thought come from? And I was like,
it's just
what a contrived way to start romantic tension, is like random thought from nowhere, freeze it.
Here's the thing about originality, is that it's less the here's an original idea, and it's more the here's an original combination of ideas.
And
it's
who
not
does
just doing
it well.
it well. But it's like, so if you've seen the movie, like what was it, Flash of Genius, the guy who invented, like, the little engine that makes windshield wipers either go fast or slow.
I thought
it's
you were going to
literally-
say the little engine that could.
Yeah, yes, the little engine that could.
When I
Anyway,
was
he
2,
invented
man,
this
that
tiny
book
circuit
was
board.
so hot.
But now it's cliche.
You mean you can try harder and it works? Oh, I can't
Yeah,
speak
so
yet,
he
but
was
that's profound.
So he was in the court case, and he's trying to prove the originality because like Ford was going after him, and Ford claimed that it was their idea. And so what he described was those individual parts are not new. They've been used before. It's a circuit board. You have transistors, resistors, etc. But what was original was a combination of things. And he used an example of a book. He said, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Was that original? No, in fact, it was inspired from the Bible, but he used different words, he used different combinations, and he applied it in a different situation. So if you're looking for originality, it really doesn't matter that everything is completely new. It just matters that you do a combination that no one else has done before. That's what matters. And you don't have to worry
Star
about
Wars
being
is
all
basically-
original.
Star Wars is basically like samurai story in space.
And then
Yeah,
another good
laser
example.
Star
that-
Wars is a lot of things. It's
good
just a
example-
mishmash collection
Star
that's
Wars
put
is a lot of
together.
things mashed together. But a good example with Pico, because Pico mentioned that he did stuff for Cry for Eternity, which is one of my favorite Twilight Alicorn stories ever. A long time ago, there was a story, I forget the name of it, but it basically involved Celestia going into the forever sleep that Odin goes into, and Twilight having to take up the mantle of Princess of the Sun until she gets better. And Cry for Eternity is basically that, except Celestia dies. Spoilers.
The real eternal sleep.
A real forever sleep.
And I just finished the one where Celestia's a changeling, and it's basically the same idea.
Or another thing before I ask the next question for Pico is with
Pico, I think.
or Pico. I'm sorry. I live in Mexico, or not Mexico. I live in Arizona. So
Oh my god, that's so bad.
Which is basically Mexico.
Oh,
But no.
Hey, to be fair, I said it Pico too. You might have
But,
just copied what I said.
But so
hey, it's okay to call me
if you look at the-
Pico, but if you get Mexico and Arizona mixed up, that's a lot worse.
Well, I've been playing a lot of Victoria 2, and Mexico owned Arizona and Victoria 2. So, but no,
Keep it on topic,
fair
guys.
enough.
keeping it on topic.
Yeah.
If you look at the featured box for My Little Pony, like I think last week, I'm going to use last week as an example. There was a bunch, and I don't know why, but there was a bunch of stories where Spike ends up just either A, with somebody, or B, going on a hero's journey. And I guess that's the popular format for this week, but... And,
that has to deal with the way Fanfiction has reset up. So on the side of a
so
story...
they reset it up?
Well, no, on the side of a story, it shows related stories that people liked. So if everyone's reading one fic, and then it says, okay, of these 300 people who've read this fic, hey, look, 30 people have read this other fic, so it'll recommend it, so then it boosts it.
Let's go with, what was it? The Scoot Adoption. Scoot Adoption. Scoot Adoption is not an original concept. It's never really been an original concept because ever since they introduced Scootaloo, they've been like, oh, is she adopted? As they developed her character, people started asking that question. The thing is, though, is that there's no set way to do a good Scoot Adoption right now. As long as you introduce something brand new, and just something that draws the reader in, it will generally be a good story. And I just threw something on the floor. So, if that's since
that covers everything.
I think that covers everything. Morning, are you gonna go, or are you gonna stay for the next question?
I'm gonna go.
Okay.
So hopefully
right,
I can
see ya.
be around for the whole time next time. But
Yeah, we'll figure out a good time to do the next one. But so say good.
It's not like coordinating this one with all our different times was hard or something. I mean, it
Oh,
only
yeah.
took how many months?
Luckily, school is the actual real life school is starting, so I'm free most of the time in August, and I just knock something over again.
Dude,
Well-
you gotta stop knocking things over.
No.
Anyway, away.
All right, peace, Zephyr.
See you, Zephyr. So the next question that we have for I'm gonna keep calling you Pico. I'm sorry.
I'm used to it. Just think
It's-
Pie Company.
Yeah. The next question for Pico is from the Red Knight. He asked, "How do you show, not tell landscape?"
Okay, so showing versus not telling a landscape, there's 2.5 parts to this question. One is to understand the audience again. It used to be in the 16 to like 1800s, like it was not uncommon for the popular stories to have the first 10 to 20 pages sometimes be entirely about the landscape and the setting, because people were exploring new things, and but they never really explored away from their home. So if you wanted to read about a jungle, you had to read it from a book, because you couldn't really get a painting. There weren't photographs, there weren't TV, and there wasn't the internet. Because of that, it's always been very telly in the past, because it was acceptable, and it did something in a way that nothing else could for a lot of people. Nowadays, show is more popular because we have the internet and TV and photographs. The other part about it is it's really popular. Not when I say it's popular nowadays to talk about show, I don't just mean like it's encouraged. There's a lot of people who are like, it has to be show, not tell, and that's not realistic. Even EQD, where they say we want show, not tell, that's generally because tell isn't as good. But going back to that beginning book of the Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It's a very telly beginning to a book, but it's considered one of the best intros of all time. I mean, we all know it, even though we haven't read it. There's a great article by a book player on Fanfiction. I'll try to link that later, but where she talks about, like, of the 100 best intros, it's at least a quarter to a half of them are very telly. So tell, when it comes to like landscape and an area, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It has to do with what you want your reader to get out of it. Now, if you do want to show the landscape, there's a couple different things to do. And I'm going to actually relate this a lot to movies and video games, because they're newer and they do it a certain way. It's how people are used to it. If you follow something, so for instance, it's not just a tree in a field, it's a phoenix perched atop elm tree surrounded by a field. By focusing on the specifics of the phoenix, the field, it becomes a more environmental effect, which is a little bit more showy. You can also add some extra details to change the focus. So it's changes to the phoenix perched atop the burned out husk of an elm tree. Well, when you say a burned out husk of an elm tree, it's technically very telly in a lot of ways, but it also requires a lot more thought. And if you add in even more detail, like an action, so the phoenix perched atop the burned out husk of an elm tree scanned the surrounding countryside, the surrounding fields for movement. Well, I'm not saying that the phoenix was looking for food, that it was hunting. What I'm saying is that it's just looking around, and that's becomes a lot more showy because there's a lot more depth to it. And I've always struggled with show versus tell, but when it comes to the purpose of show versus tell, as long as you're adding more depth to your writing, where there's as much not being said as being said, it makes the writing more condensed and more efficient and more interesting to the reader, and that's really what you want when you're talking about wanting show versus tell. And so focusing on animals, movement, action going on in the scene is a great way to do show. Focusing on making it a little bit more poetic. So if you think of a description of a sunset, if you quote, paint the picture more, and you make it flow and go back and forth in a very poetic style, it tends to feel a little bit warmer as a writing style. And that's the other thing you want in show versus tell, is you want it to be more relatable and warm, and it has more emotion attached to it. So that's really the best ways I know of to do show versus tell, or to show a landscape. And those are kind of the situations when I think it's good to show in a landscape.
And I'm back, by the way. But and with yeah, but with and show versus tell especially is very important depending on the genre you're in too. It's not. I like to think, at least with comedy, it's not nearly as important to show the landscape as much, while you show the people a lot better.
Yeah.
But in horror or adventure is where you really want to show the landscape.
In milieu stories, if you go by, I can't remember who wrote Ender's Game.
I have the book. Where'd it go? Scott Card.
Orson Scott Card has a thing called the mice quotient, which is the focus of the story, and one of them, the M in mice, stands for milieu, which is basically, it's about the world. So Lord of the Rings is the classic milieu story, because they start in one place, and then they're going out and they're exploring the world, and then they come back. That's, in essence, a milieu story. For that, landscape is very important. He did that very well.
Another good example of that kind of a story is, if anyone has ever played the Souls games, especially Dark Souls, the first one, that's basically Dark Souls. Except, you don't come back. But Dark Souls, the only introduction you get to Dark Souls is the beginning there was like darkness and dragons, and then fire came into being, and then they killed all the dragons, and that's basically all you get. And then they introduce you in a prison. I censored myself. Don't worry. They introduce you in a prison, and that you don't know why you're in the prison, other than the fact that you're kind of undead, and they give you no direction other than go towards that place and try not to die too much.
Yeah, it's not the biggest plot.
Yeah.
It's not about the character, it's about the world.
It's about the world. It's not
also, for video games, gameplay comes in to be a big thing.
Yeah.
I think we're going to end up using video games a lot, but
because
when it comes to...
The reason we're using video games so much is because I hate saying it, and it makes me sad, but they are, for at least the upcoming generation, the one after ours, they are replacing books.
That's sad, but...
And it is sad. But they're not like completely replacing books or phasing books out or whatever, but they are becoming the replacement for a lot of media that is attention grabbing.
You say that, but people tend to overestimate how much people used to read. They really do.
It's a storytelling format that's a bit different, but it's still a storytelling format. And I think that's why it's useful in examples. But like when it comes to show versus tell, a lot of it's really about the style that your readers enjoy. Some readers enjoy a lot of tell, some readers enjoy a lot of show. Some readers enjoy very compact and very efficient writing, while others enjoy large tomes of immense text.
Yeah.
But show versus tell, in its simplest form, is like tell would be he cried. Show would be a tear rolled down his cheek. It's like, it's not all that different. It's just one is implying where the other is directly stating.
No.
So it's one of those things where there are different forms of it. People look at it in different ways. It's not an exact science, but it's one of those things you get a feel for over time as you write more, as you read more, as you figure out what you like most.
Now, I brought up show versus tell, because I didn't quite know what they were going to use the question for, but do you guys have any good examples of how to show a landscape, specifically going back to the main question?
Nuke it from orbit.
You can't, I think what you described is like following a character, like having something happen and using the environment as part of the story. That helps a lot in showing.
I'm going to keep using Dark Souls because Dark Souls is actually really good at it. But no, I'm not joking. Yahtzee points it out.
I know.
If you've ever seen Yahtzee's review.
Someone on the internet liked it. Must be good.
No, but if you've ever pointed it out, if you've ever seen Yahtzee's review of it, one of the things he says is one of the best things that Dark Souls does with its skybox is in the background, right when you get to the main hub area, there's a giant castle in the sky. You're going to end up going to that giant castle in the sky. And there's just areas that you can explore, you can see. So a good example when you're writing a story, like with Fallout Equestria, we're probably gonna end up using a lot of Fallout Equestria here too. But I'm sorry. With Fallout Equestria, she shows K-Cat, she shows Canterlot, and she mentions it, and later on in the story they end up going to Canterlot.
Yeah, it becomes a lot easier to show if there's already some build-up. So if you're introducing landscape mid-story, introduce it at the beginning. Something else you brought up with Dark Souls that I forgot to mention is that make the landscape a part of your story, and it'll come a lot more naturally. So going back to my, the phoenix perched atop the burned out husk of an elm tree. Well, maybe that was the last tree in the world or something like that. By adding a purpose to the landscape and incorporating it in the story in a meaningful way, you'll put more effort towards it, and you'll do a little bit more world building around it. Yeah. And simply by doing that, when you go to write it, you'll have more you'll want to say and more things you'll want to do with it, which will encourage you to write it in slightly different way. So that can be helpful to a lot of authors, as if, you know, they have this great image in their head. By building around it, I mean, entire stories have come just from building around one simple idea. I mean, that was the whole thing with Game of Thrones. George R.R. Martin just pictured this, you know, family finding these wolves, and he built a literature empire around that one basic image he had in his head, just by building on the world.
Yep. Who said they had to go in 15 minutes?
I've got to go very soon.
Maybe we should just do your questions next.
Okay.
So I'll ask you yours. Verbose Mode asks, how do you write and make your story flow better?
So, flow better. I'm reading his question right now. It says, I'd say flow and pacing need some attention. So, and he asks after that, a lot of stories either check the reader headfirst into crap or fail to go anywhere for far too long. That he's talking about one very specific kind of pacing. And pacing and flow, there's actually 3 different kinds that people talk about, and we don't have vocabulary to differentiate between them, but I'll talk about like the first one that I notice all the time is you'll have like 2 characters that'll be in a conversation, and it will be emotive, and they'll be crying, and then they cry into each other's shoulder, and like you have just this one sentence that says like they cried for a while, and then afterwards like they're done crying and they continue talking. I'm like, it's just one sentence. I'm like, wow, they cry fast, because I don't get the sense that something happened. You're not going to write a story. It's like, we began the staring contest. 30 minutes later, I blinked. It's like, no, you're not going to do that.
Well, if you're going to do comedy, you could totally do it.
Well, you could totally pull it off in comedy, but in comedy, you can pull off anything. Anyway, like what I'm trying to say is that's the first form where the amount of text correlates to the amount of time passing. So if you're going to have a moment where there's silence or something, take a paragraph or 2 to describe the character's thoughts so that it feels like time is passing to the reader. Otherwise, it will just feel like the reader just kind of jumped over something. It's like, wow, that went by fast. That was supposed to be a moment of emotion, but like nothing really happened. Or if you can't do that, like you put, we began the staring contest, and you'll do like a horizontal rule as if it's cutting forward in time, and then you'll say, then I blinked. You're not going to say the amount of time that passed. You're just going to say that something happened. And so that's the first kind. The second kind is described in the writing guide. So you like go up, click FAQ, click writing guide, and go to pacing, and it talks about the length of your sentence and your paragraphs. If you have long sentences, you're going to expand them and put a whole bunch of words into them and make them very just flowy paragraphs. But as time goes on, you're going to shorten your sentences. You're going to cut them off. Something's going to happen. It's going to build up, then boom, there you go. And that also helps to give a sense of pace to the story. And last but not least is what Verbose Mode was asking about, is where things happen in the story. Either the story starts with a huge explosion in like the first chapter, or it's like a whole bunch of exposition and waiting for something interesting to happen. You want the hook to be there, but you don't want it to happen in the first few moments. Otherwise, you don't have any environment. You don't have any developed characters to have when that hook comes. And so at the beginning of a story, you want to develop your world just barely enough that your reader's comfortable with it, then bring in your hook. And when it comes to like the rises and troughs where you have different climaxes in your story, you need to even those out, space them so that you have moments of relaxation, moments of buildup, some big reveal or something happens, and then you go back down and you can ride that wave over and over depending on the length of your story. It might even only have one climax. It might be just one chapter long, but when it comes to pacing, you want it to flow. You use all 3 of these tools to get it to flow. And so that's what pacing and flow are. A lot of people have different concepts, different tools for that, but those are the 3 different ways of looking at it, and that's how you can apply it.
Do you want to discuss, or do you want me to ask you your next question?
We can discuss really quick and then ask the next question.
Luckily,
I've got a short answer for the next question.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to this one. So what about you, Pico? Pistachio pie.
I have a good example, and this can be scaled out, but it's a poem by Gary Provost. Provost? I don't know how to pronounce his last name. But it applies to not only the sentence length, but it can also kind of demonstrate the same thing for story. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes, when I am certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it is important. It really shows how everything from the little sentences to the big sentences matter. And varying things is very important because... Yeah, I love it.
You should link that. I've never heard of that.
I do. I posted it on the School for New Writers even. I'll probably link in the description for this video when you put it up too.
Okay.
It's... When you're talking about engaging the reader and flow, a big part of that and engaging the reader as a whole is how much kind of brain activity people are using. And when people have active brains, there's 2 big things that trigger for them. It's things that are familiar and things that are unique. You can actually set this up with how something reads or sounds, and this is one of the reasons why pop music, going back to pop music again, is popular, is there's a certain setup where it's A, B, A, B, C, B. So you have like the first part of the song, and then you have the chorus. And then you have the second part of the song, and then you have the chorus. And then you're going back to a variation of the first one, and because it's all done very similar, your brain is expecting something, and it fulfills that promise. But by changing it a little bit, it still remains engaging. So having something that's familiar and something that's unique stands out to a lot of people, and by varying sentence length and even chapter length, and how everything flows together, you do that effectively without anyone realizing it. That's one of the higher forms of writing that when you start off with, you're not necessarily the best at, because you're looking at the sentence to sentence, the paragraph, maybe just the basic plot. But as you start entwining things together, that difference matters.
And that's also why with pop music, there's a lot of most pop music you'll only remember, if you remember anything from the song at all, you'll only remember the chorus.
Yeah.
Yep.
There
Or
are
that
exceptions
C.
to that rule. You'll either remember the chorus or the beginning part of it.
Yeah, that's about it. Or perhaps a melody.
Yeah, or
Max.
the melody. So here's the next question for Piercing before he gets off. Seraph Pilcrow asks, where does one draw the line between acceptable artistic license and unacceptable implausibility? How do I handle situations where a realistic outcome would be determined detrimental to the story, but the artistic license outcome would be detrimental to the story's believability?
I imagine he's asking about Deus Ex Machina, which happens all the freaking time. But
Especially in Ponyfix.
oh yeah. Anyway, here's what I would recommend. Look up Brandon Sanderson, click on the Wikipedia page, and look at Sanderson's laws. He talks about the laws of magic. And he talks about the way that you perceive magic and how good it is. Like his first law, an author's ability to solve conflict satisfactorily with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic, which leads to the second law. Limitations are greater than powers. If your magic has rules and limitations and restrictions, then that makes the magic feel more realistic and less Deus Ex Machina when it comes into play. And he also has a third law. Expand what you already have before you add something new, which means don't just keep throwing in random new things. Like if you're going to have the end of a story, have it be built off of the thing the reader already knows. Don't bring in something new about magic or about some whatever magic powers that you have in order to resolve the story. For example, the end of the Aragon series. Holy crap, was that a Deus Ex Machina? Just out of nowhere. Oh, hey, there's a whole bunch of dragon
Oh, please don't. I haven't read the last book.
Sorry. Anyway,
Aragorn punches Gandalf in the throat.
Gandalf?
Anyway,
where did he come in?
You don't want to bring in new stuff when you're doing a conclusion. You want it to be built off of the things that you already have. You can use magic, yes, or like whatever special powers or things that you want, but you have to have the balance between things being magic, things being pure luck, and things just coming out of nowhere that the reader had no idea even existed. And you want to find the middle of that road and not deviate from that in order for your ending to be perfect.
Which is also why, like in Dragon Ball, like I'm going to use anime as actually a really good example for this. The best anime, I can't really cite an example because a lot of anime break the rule, but the best anime are the ones that follow their rules and either have the character push through the rules, like I'm going to use, let's say, early Dragon Ball Z as an example, push through those rules, and then they don't ignore their own rules. While in other anime, like SAO, or for those of you that don't watch anime, Sword Art Online, where they state their rules, and instead of pushing through the rules and establishing new rules, they break the rules and never mention it again. I'm not going to cite any reasons, because if for whatever reason you want to watch SAO, go for it. But there are scenes in Sword Art Online where he completely breaks the game's rules, and there's no reason for it to be like that. I'm going to cite one example. Someone dies, and for some reason, in Sword Art Online, it says if you die in the game, you die. You dead. For whatever reason, he's able to bring back the person who died about 20-30 seconds after they died. And he wasn't there. He didn't have like a defibrillator to, clear their brain that just got microwaved.
Yeah, it's like you don't want to ever have a perfectly happy ending, because if you do, then it's like, oh, everything went too perfectly. Your readers will perceive that, and reading critics will most definitely critique that.
There was a
that starts going into yes and no but mechanics.
Yep. There was a Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess fanfic I read, which it wasn't even a fanfic, it was a novelization of the game. And the only difference that it had in the novelization was how Link, because he made Link into a character instead of a copy-paste of grunts and screams, it was how Link interpreted his journey and how he handled his journey. And instead of being the mindless puppet of the player, or as the game explains it, destiny, Link was an unwilling... I'm not even kidding. That's how they explain Link. He is the hero of the chosen hero. Link does not take to being the chosen hero well. He's still mortal. He's not shown running around from the water dungeon then going, okay, we got the water dungeon done, let's go to the fire dungeon. No. He, in one of the scenes, gets out of the desert dungeon, and Midna is like, okay, let's go to the next dungeon. And Link is like bleeding and dying and is like, I'm gonna lay here for a minute. Lays down, and Midna starts screaming at him, but he passed out.
Oh, man. That part of the story, holy crap.
Yeah. And then even at the end, because you guys are probably never gonna find the story because I ain't linking it, at the end of the story, when Midna goes away, instead of just going about his happy life like the hero of time, he literally breaks when Midna goes away. Because he fell in love with Midna as the game progresses, or as the novel progresses, and that is shown in game. Is Link getting more effective?
In the game, I was crying at the part where I'm like running with a wolf who's like, Midna, don't die.
This story, and I'm going to actually get more into this as I go into the protagonist antagonist.
Anyway, I've got to go now.
Oh yeah, he has to go.
All right. I'll see you guys.
Yeah.
Peace.
But since Steven's gone, let me continue since this does segue really well into my question. He changed. He went from being an ignorant boy who lived in his happy village to a war-torn hero who could not stay in his village anymore. He had to go out and do something. And that's really, I think, how you can, with artistic license, and it helps with the artistic license and outcome, that's really how you're supposed to do it. You're not supposed to throw in new stuff. You're supposed to use your characters well.
Well, one of the things with artistic license when it comes to, the story would say this, but, artistically it should be this other thing.
Yeah.
Is make the artistic, that artistic license an aha moment.
Yeah.
So actually, Brandon, I think it's actually, it was Brandon Sanderson. He was talking about. I'm actually reading some of his books right now, for the Mistborn series. But
the Mistborn series, is it? I'm trying to remember the title for it. What was the first book called? The first
Mistborn.
Mistborn. Okay,
And then the other one was like I have it right here, the Well of Ascension is the second one. Anyway, so the first one is he has this very specific world. He follows all of his rules very well. At the end, there's this aha moment with the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And because, it's technically kind of this new thing, but it fits within the rules of the world. It's just, hey, the rules say this, and it works that way. But, we didn't know about this one other thing that, it remains within the rules. There's just this obscure knowledge, but it fits in perfectly, and we've led up to it, and we've foreshadowed it. That helps a lot. The other thing is, I lost my train of thought. Oh, God. We're all gonna die. The Harry Potter series did a really bad job of staying consistent with its rules, but each individual book was consistent with the rules. So for some stuff, you can get away with being inconsistent as long as, if you're going between multiple books, it's a multi-book series, or, fan fiction that plays off of fan fiction that plays off of fan fiction. Each individual thing can have its own unique set of rules. That's actually what fan fiction is, hey, you have this world, Doctor Who, but in my story, it's a little bit different. Make those differences clear when you do that.
And segueing into fan fiction real fast before I go into mine, with crossovers, and this is where people break artistic license a lot. With crossovers, the main reason Fallout Equestria worked is because with the crossover, she took things that were already in My Little Pony, magic for one, which already don't have that many rules associated with it, because the My Little Pony magic really doesn't, and basically takes that and tells the reader, these are the rules for magic, and this is what happened to the world because of those rules.
Yes, and it didn't change the base story
for Fallout, because she used Fallout's setting.
It didn't even change the base story from the My Little Pony universe. It just continued it, and it showed the change and how it got there, which is different from a lot of crossovers, because usually it's just, hey, look, these worlds are combined, or we're just replacing these characters with these other characters. She did a third thing.
Another really good crossover that it was the first one was really good. The other ones kind of went downhill. Was one where it was where Rainbow Dash's father is a member of the Wonderbolts. The Wonderbolts, and it's a Mass Effect crossover, where basically when Nightmare Moon was banished by Celestia realized that her solar system was covered by a Dyson sphere. And she shatters the Dyson sphere. And a Dyson sphere stops time inside of its area. That way it can collect permanent energy from a star.
I think you're getting way too technical for
getting way
something.
too technical for some people. But basically, it follows the rules of Mass Effect by basically saying that the ponies were a constructed race, and what they use isn't magic, it's whatever it is they use in Mass Effect. But I think that's enough on artistic license. But going to the next question, Dainty Blaze asks, how do you write a protagonist and an antagonist? To get a better view, I'm going to just read the full question. I'd say that constructing a good protagonist and antagonist is my question, not just making a good character, but how is your protagonist essential to the story? Is he a stayer, meaning they stay the same, or are they a changer? What makes your character the protagonist or the antagonist? Well, the final part to your question is easy to answer. The protagonist is who you follow in the story, and the antagonist is who goes against them in the story. The protagonist and antagonist can be the hero or the villain. It does not matter. But whoever goes against your protagonist is instantly the antagonist until you either get rid of them or they're never mentioned again. And there are examples of an antagonist never being really mentioned again where it works really well. But for a protagonist, a good example for a protagonist is actually Twilight Sparkle. Whenever people joke about saying Applejack's a side character, blah 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 blah, every character in My Little Pony is a side character to Twilight Sparkle. I'm sorry to say that.
Depending on the episode, but as a whole, yes.
It does depend on the episode, because as their title, fan-given title suggests, the main six, they are the main six characters, but Twilight Sparkle is mainer sixer than they are, basically. Twilight Sparkle is, as America says in Hitalia, the hero of the story. The other six basically are, I'm not going to say conduit, because that would be cruel for the base of the story of what My Little Pony is. The other six are the, not pedestal, what's the word? They're the
pillar?
The pillar that she stands on to be the hero. They help her be the hero. That's their job. Without them, she would basically be nothing, but they would still function without her, basically. And it is shown that way in the show, where in the beginning of the show, they were still going about their everyday lives without Twilight Sparkle. Twilight Sparkle needs her friends more than they need her, and it has been shown that way in the show. The only exception to that is Pinkie Pie, but Pinkie Pie breaks rules all the time. But with the protagonist, is the one thing you have to really take into account when you make your protagonist is, will people like my character? And this is why, even though you're telling me, not just making a good character, but making a good character is part of being a good protagonist and a good antagonist. I've seen stories and I've read stories where I've liked the villain more than I've liked the hero. I've liked the antagonist more than I like the protagonist. And here, stories can be really good like that. But basically, you have to have a good character. Is your character likable? Is your antagonist not likable? Or even, is he likable? There are some antagonists that people absolutely despise. A good example is any of the Conversion Bureau stories. Celestia is a very hated antagonist in most of those stories, because she's kind of a jerk. By, wiping humanity off the face of the planet. Who wants that? Is your antagonist likable? A good example from a story from Fallout Equestria, because we're going to keep using it, is Little Pip. I loved Little Pip when I read the story. I grew with her as the story went on. And
Little Pip is the protagonist.
Yeah, I said that.
Oh, I thought you were saying a good example of an antagonist.
No,
my bad.
A good example of an antagonist in Fallout Equestria would probably be the goddess. But for a hero, for your protagonist, you also have to add in the mentor. Also, because sure, you can have a protagonist show up completely out of the blue. Your protagonist show up completely out of the blue and be like, it was a normal day in Ponyville, and my protagonist is the hero, and all that garbage. But the mentor character, it does not have to be, the wizened old wizard like Merlin, but your mentor character is the character that you introduce that shows and points your protagonist on his journey. This normally only applies to adventure, such as Gandalf with Frodo, or Bilbo with Frodo, or Gandalf with Bilbo, but it still helps to have a mentor character. Twilight Sparkle's mentor character, who pointed her on her way, is obviously Celestia, and she still gets more mentors as the show goes on, when Zecora, Cadence, those characters, and they help her grow. That's why a stayer protagonist and a stayer antagonist don't work. You can be a really good writer and make them work, but a character who doesn't change is a boring character. That's generally why goddesses and gods, like I wrote in my lecture, are really, really hard to write, because gods don't change.
Well, there is a way to do it, and that's if you notice most of the more famous stories, the protagonist starts off very passive. Yeah, they might do something in their life, but it's the antagonist who ruins their sense of either what they want or where they're going. So in Star Wars, Luke just wants to be on the farm with his family. He has normal kid things to do. It's not shown particularly well for Star Wars, but his life changes when the Empire invades his life. In My Little Pony, Twilight just wants to study. She wants to be a good student. She wants to succeed and make her mentor proud. But when her mentor's kidnapped, it provokes her to action. So usually you have a more passive protagonist who has their goals that they might be working for, but in relation to the world, they're passive. And then the antagonist does something, and then the protagonist reacts. And eventually it'll get to the point where the protagonist is taking action against the antagonist.
Yes.
And now this can work the other way with anti-heroes too, where you have, I'm busy conquering the world, and who's this little bastard? Oh my god, he beat the crap out of me. My empire's ruined. I'm gonna go get him. And if you can still focus on that character, even though they're the villain, they're an anti-hero, because they were doing something a little bit more passive, and then they had to react to the antagonist.
And then there's another good example in the pony fandom is actually Little Pip is another example of the protagonist that you gave out. She was content, well, not really content, but she did her job and she didn't care about the outside world. And then when Velvet Remedy, if you haven't read Fallout Equestria in the nearly 5 years it's been out, Velvet Remedy leaves the stable, tricks the stable into letting her leave. Little Pip goes after her, and you see her progress from innocent vault dweller to, oh my god, you are the Messiah character. And that's honestly why I still think the Stayer character, like as I pointed out in the Legend of Zelda fanfic that I read, the Stayer character, that Link is in the Legend of Zelda games, not counting Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, because that's actually a really good example of protagonist Link, is the Stayer character is not that... It can be done really well, but it is not the preferred character for a protagonist or an antagonist, because people want to see progression. People want to grow with a character. The most likable characters are the ones that you grow with. That's why most video games that are narrative focused, especially role-playing games, focus on your character progressing. Pokemon focuses on you becoming the Pokemon Master, you becoming the best. Mass Effect focuses on your character's growth from just a normal commander to a savior of worlds. That kind of thing. There are stayer protagonists early on in franchises like Halo, where Master Chief basically stays the same up until about Halo 4. Where nothing really seems to faze him, and then Halo 4 is when you start to see him really go down the rabbit hole. And
video games are also a little bit hard to compare, but...
Yeah, video games are hard to compare, but they do show... They're hard to compare writing, but they do show a protagonist that changes. For writing, Lord of the Rings is a good example. Hobbit is not. Lord of the Rings is a good example mostly because of the fact that Frodo goes out into the world an ignorant bastard. That's not even a
He's not completely ignorant.
He's not completely
he knows enough to know he doesn't know anything.
Yeah, he goes out ignorant, and his experiences completely change him. If you watch Lord of the Rings from the beginning to the end, even if you don't read it, you'll notice his entire demeanor changed. He went from being a happy but not content boy to being a silent man.
Well, if I understand it right, the movie is also different from the books a lot.
Yeah.
I had real trouble getting into Lord of the Rings because 90% of the characters were college-educated older white men. And just like, oh, I'm a college-educated older white dwarf man, and I'm an elf man. But supposedly in the book, I guess, when they go back to the Shire, like they defeat some monsters and stuff like that, and it really shows growth. But something I want to touch on earlier, when you were talking about Fall Equestria, with Velvet Remedy leaves the stable, foils the main character's life, and then the main character takes action because of Velvet Remedy. She's an antagonist at the very beginning of the story.
She's an Velvet Remedy is, as we stated before, the antagonist does not need to be the hero.
Mm-hmm. And the
The first thing.
Wait.
Little Pip's antagonist is not Red Eye or the Goddess until after she finds Velvet Remedy.
Yes, and the thing is that Velvet Remedy only ever foils Little Pip and Little Pip's goals in the first chapter. You get between chapters, I want to say it's 3, or it's like 2, 3, 4, and 5, or 2 through 5, or something like that. And there is no antagonist. It's just kind of wandering until something happens.
Well, not even that. The world's the antagonist at that point.
It is, but it's also not something that feels like there's no specific motivation. Yeah. It feels like. So I would actually say that's the weakest part of that story is between chapters like 2 and 3 or 5 and 6. Not saying it's a bad story. I'm just saying there's no real provocative things happening other than just random chance, which isn't fulfilling as a reader.
I'm actually kind of glad. Well, do you have to leave anytime soon?
No, I don't have to go till I go to work.
Okay, cool. When do you go to work?
11 p.m.
Okay, cool. So we can actually talk about this for a bit longer. But because do you have another question that you have to have?
No, I had one less question, but I tend to insert myself in everything like a jerk.
Okay. Well, then I can just keep talking about the protagonist.
Well, let's try and keep
the protagonist-antagonist thing, the cool thing about it is we can actually touch on some of the questions we touched on, which is fantastic. But with another good example of there being an antagonist in stories, if you read Past Sins, which is old and kind of sucks now. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad story, but you can tell its age.
If you read it for the first time and you've already read a lot of other fan fiction, it won't be as good.
Well, not
but
even
that's
that.
also because a lot of people borrowed from it.
You can tell when it came out. Because if you watch the show, if you've been watching the show, you can see its age. The Past Sins, the beginning part of the story, the antagonist was that cult that basically helped make Nyx. And the story tricks you into thinking that Twilight Sparkle, even though the description says it's going to be Nyx, it tricks you into thinking Twilight Sparkle is the protagonist, when she is actually the deuteragonist, meaning she is the secondary main character. And that's also why you have to be careful, because you can have more than one main protagonist. So an example of it is in Past Sins. Past Sins has about 3 main characters. Because I'm going to count the Cutie Mark Crusaders as one character. The first main character is Nyx, the secondary is Twilight, and the third is the Cutie Mark Crusaders. And the antagonist, there are about 2 or 3. There are a bunch of antagonists.
There are 3, one of which is also one of the protagonists.
Yeah, but there are 4 main protagonists in Past Sins. Celestia, I don't remember the main character.
You mean there's 4 main antagonists?
Yeah, 4 main antagonists. Celestia. I'm trying not to spoil it. Celestia, the Cult of Nightmare, Diamond Tiara, and Ponyville. Actually, no, 5. Nyx.
Yep.
Nyx, even though she is still the protagonist, switches to being the antagonist once you follow Twilight Sparkle's point of view. And that's the things you have to really take into account. Whose point of view are you following? Because if it's a first-person point of view, you have a lot more leeway with your antagonists and your protagonists.
Penstroke did a really good job of making the characters feel real and organic, going back to that question. So when you change perspective, it kind of changed the perspective in the story, which keeps it fresh, and helps also show some of the events in a different light. So when one character thinks, "Oh, this is funny,"
because if you go
ahead.
Horrible. Oh, but no, bouncing off what you said, if you look at when he switches from Twilight Sparkle's point of view to the Cutie Mark Crusaders, the Cutie Mark Crusaders still view Nyx as a friend, thus making her, even though she's the antagonist, thus making her the protagonist still. Because they even though she has caused Eternal Night, they don't view her as the villain. They still view her as a friend who's misguided.
You also have, there's that one point where Nyx runs into a bout of trouble and starts sympathizing with the antagonist, at which point the antagonist to Nyx starts shifting away from being an antagonist and becomes kind of a support character for a while. And then if they have troubles again... starts going the other direction back.
And
So
Twilight Sparkle, when Celestia takes Nyx away from Twilight Sparkle, she instantly stops being the mentor and becomes her enemy. And becomes the antagonist, because in that scene, Twilight Sparkle attacks Celestia, thus switching her status over from mentor to antagonist.
Mm-hmm.
And Celestia realizes it in the story.
The switch happens when Celestia starts foiling Twilight.
Yeah.
That's when the switch happens, and then it's Twilight's reaction that really makes her stand out as a protagonist, because she's not just going along with it. She's actively doing something.
And even though I hate using the scale. I really hate using the scale, but I'm going to use the scale. If anyone plays any form of dungeon game, Dungeons and Dragons, whatever, they have the scale of good, evil, and neutral. There's chaotic evil, chaotic good.
In some systems, the D20 derivatives, but not a lot of the others.
I am going to use D&D's system for this. What is your character's alignment? Because if your character aligns a certain way, they will always have an antagonist. Celestia is lawful good in every sense of the word because she writes the law of the freaking land. Luna, when she became Nightmare Moon, is chaotic good. She still wants what's best for the world and for her ponies, but she does it in a way that gets rid of the norm that Celestia put forth, or the world put forth. Twilight Sparkle is just good. Twilight Sparkle in past tense is good. She's neutral good. She's not lawful good because she breaks Celestia's rules a lot during that entire thing. And she's not chaotic good because she still doesn't completely break them. She follows her own personal alignment. And the Cutie Mark Crusaders could be neutral, and Nightmare Moon / Nyx is still chaotic good because she still doesn't really know what's going on. And
I don't know if that really necessarily applies specifically, because the D&D scale is very specific to the point of, well, yeah, by this country's rules you're chaotic, but by this country's rules you're lawful. You're just, I'm following a different set of laws. There's a lot of weird loopholes and forcing people to do stuff. So
okay, you know what? Here's a better example for that. I'm going to use religion. I don't like using religion. I'm going to do it anyway.
Well, how about we transition this into the next question?
Then I'll start using religion. No. Jarvie Jared asks, how do you integrate philosophy into your story? Let me go to his actual question, but basically, I'm pretty sure. Let me go down to the thread. Where did the thread go? Hello, Mr. Thread. There you are. Basically, he's asking, is there a way to seamlessly integrate, meaning perfectly, which is not true, integrate ideas of philosophy into writing without having two characters openly discuss them, as in discuss without discussion? Philosophy, it depends on the philosophy and the idea that you're trying to put forth. The hero's journey, which is a philosophy, even though it's a literary tool, but it is also a philosophy. The hero's journey is one of those that you don't need to discuss. The hero wakes up one morning, something happens in his life, he goes on his journey, he comes back changed. That is the hero's journey in a nutshell. You don't need your characters to openly discuss the hero's journey, if that makes sense. Because your reader will already understand, unless you can still do it really well. You can write the hero's journey in such a way that it doesn't seem like it's the hero's journey. The Twilight Sparkle of the Royal Guard does that, where she introduces, where the writer says, Shining Armor became Celestia's student, Twilight Sparkle goes to military school and becomes a member of the military. And it starts off as a pretty normal military thing where, you're just
actually,
going
I want to read
life,
that now.
But she's in the military. And then it segues into something happened to Princess Cadence, Twilight Sparkle gets sent to do it, and her journey begins there. And it wasn't the work of and it goes from there, and there's, even throughout the story, nothing really bad happened. It's just Celestia lost contact with Princess, not lost contact, but Cadence has to go somewhere. Twilight Sparkle's assigned to go with Cadence. And that's basically how it starts. It doesn't start as the Empire killing Twilight Sparkle's family. It starts as Twilight Sparkle being assigned a mission to escort Princess Cadence. And there are other philosophies that are inputted into fanfiction on Fimfic, where one of them, like in Past Sins, what is the idea that it's not really, I can't see the issue with philosophy is almost anything can be a philosophy, but I'm calling everything I'm talking about.
Let's try to stick to the more traditional
one of the ideas that
theories
Past
of
Sins
philosophy.
puts in your head is it is okay to go against authority. It's okay, but it is acceptable to go against the authority of someone if they take your kid. Or is society... Oh, go.
Let's go to the main character. The when you're asking the question, I think they're asking more traditional philosophy.
Okay.
So they're talking about, like, you know, do the ends justify the means?
Yeah.
And I think the best way to talk about this, personally, the way I view it, is in real life. How do different philosophies interchange? And there's a couple different ways. One of them, the best example to use for this is dealing with race issues. So if you are part of a minority in America and you're dealing with negative race issues, it's talked about. People will complain about it because it happens to them. They see it, and they're much more. They're looking for it, so they find it more. Sometimes they find it where it does exist, and sometimes they find it when it's very subtle. But you know, as a white person in America, it becomes a lot harder because it doesn't affect me directly as much, so it's harder for me to see about it. So for me to conceptualize and understand it, I have to talk about it in a lot more straightforward sense. Like, this is the discussion about race. Because it's not as integrated into my culture to talk about it.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about how to include philosophy in a work without having characters talk about it, you need to really look at how the culture of the characters is, because in some cultures, like there's one culture in, I believe, South America, where until a person is buried, they're not technically dead. So while they're saving up money for a funeral, they have them basically mummifying in a certain thing, and they're considered part of the family until they are buried. I mean, that's something that they don't necessarily talk about. They just do, and they pick up on that from a young age. It's not discussed. It's just there, and a kid learns it just by seeing how others treat it, and that's how they learn. So when you're talking about how to incorporate it, you can also look at how kids learn philosophy from parents. They pick it up without discussing it. They pick it up from seeing others' actions.
Another good example, even though human and equestria fics are horrible examples for most things, but for this example, human and equestria fics do tend to work because, as cited in those stories, humanity has a different view on the world than My Little Pony does. Friendship does not solve everything in the human world. It really doesn't. And I'm not going to say I'm not going to cite the tropes of, all humans are bastard or humans are the real monsters or whatever. But one example used in a lot of stories, especially Equestria Total War, which was a really good fic, you should go read it, where the main character is summoned to Equestria to help, or accidentally ends up in Equestria, and he ends up fighting a war with the Griffins, with Celestia, and the war is basically a Napoleonic War, which even though he knows what Napoleonic War is, he never fought in a Napoleonic War. So he has to basically bullshit his way around the war, and he has to help Equestria prepare for a war they weren't prepared for. And he has to basically explain because as Americans, and a lot of people, a lot of parents especially, like to pretend like we aren't, but we really are. As Americans, we are desensitized to war. We've been that way since Vietnam ended because we see it so
We're
often
desensitized to a war in a different place. If
Yeah.
war was on our doorstep, we would not be desensitized to it.
Yeah.
But media presents it in a very specific way because they do not want.
So, as Americans, we are desensitized to wars ashore because the last time America was invaded was the War of 1812. And the author uses the desensitized to war part by showing that the human, while he's still being affected by the war in his own way, he's relying on religion. He's a Christian, so he's relying on his religion a lot to try and make him not go crazy. His soldiers and the populace of Equestria are handling the war much differently. The first battle ends basically how the American Civil War, the American Revolution ends, where they just retreat. They retreat outright because the ponies have no idea what's going on, and they're fighting a force that is used to war because the author plays on the fact that these are ponies. These are a herbivore species that runs at the sense of danger compared to a predatory species that runs and is the danger. And that's how you can incorporate a lot of philosophies, at least from the human world, into it, is by, one, including a human character, even though it's very frowned upon in the fandom, but you can do it correctly, it works. Or two, having a human concept be personified in the story. War is a concept that is only not even touched on in Equestria in My Little Pony, but it is touched on a lot in our own history and our own lore, and you are able to seamlessly integrate the war into it, but you have to be careful with how you do it. You can still say war by name, but you can't have characters who normally wouldn't incite war, like Celestia, Luna. These characters just say, oh, you want war, we'll give you war. You have to have them be hesitant. You have to have them build into it.
Yeah, and we're talking around a couple of things.
Yeah.
So character reactions are a great way. I have a friend who does not drink. He just never ever has alcohol, and I get the impression that, if no one drank alcohol, he would be much happier. He doesn't, I don't think, want other people drinking alcohol because of their because of how some people act when they get drunk. So he specifically avoids talking about it. He's very polite because he knows it's an unpopular opinion. So when you're talking about how to integrate a philosophy, and specifically around characters, it's a really good idea to kind of develop how not only the philosophy being discussed and understanding it, but how each individual character understands it, why they came to those decisions, what influences they have had, and then how they react to instances where that philosophy might be touched upon if not openly discussed. If I ask him for a drink, he's like, no, he just turned it down. And then, like, the third time I offered him a drink, it was, after, 4 or 5 times of us hanging out, he's like, no, I don't drink. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bother you about that. He's like, no, it's cool, I just, I don't drink, I don't like being around people when they're drunk a lot, but, it's something that everyone does. So, he learns to deal with that, even though he doesn't necessarily agree with it.
Another thing that My Little Pony did, like the actual show My Little Pony did really well with a philosophy, was during the season premiere for season 5, they introduced this, and everyone's seen it. They introduced the society with the whole equal mark thing.
Yeah, the communists.
The communists. And the moment, and with Americans at least, the moment they saw that, they're like, that's communism. They knew that was communism, but it was never talked about as communism. But if you show that in another country, like, say, one of the European countries like Germany, Russia, those kind of areas where communism was a big thing and still kind of is a big thing, they would notice it, but it wouldn't click with them that fast, And
I don't entirely know if that's true, because a lot of those European countries will have communist parties, and they are more, if you look at there's various scales, but if you look at them, a lot of Europeans fall closer on that communist scale
than Americans do.
Yeah, but you also start talking about, the difference between communism and socialism, because technically there's been no major communist state in the world ever because it's been socialist in China and Russia and stuff. It's not communism.
Well, getting off the politics,
yeah.
That's basically how it is for at least Americans anyway, where they notice, they're like, wait a minute, that's communism, and they didn't have to tell me that was communism. Why is that in my show?
Yeah, but also notice how we were talking about as communism, even though it's... And that one actually is an actual depiction of communism, even though what's usually depicted as communism is socialism.
You know what's funny? That actually still isn't a depiction of communism, though, because Starlight Glimmer still has her cutie mark and is still in control.
Yes, but the way it was presented up until that point was communist, and then it gets into her taking advantage. Anyway, that's separate. But the point is that people can get stuff wrong. People have opinions and prejudices that they bring to the table when they're talking about philosophy. That's another way you can incorporate talking about it.
Another good example to incorporate it is for like Mass Effect, and I'm going to keep using Mass Effect, but for Mass Effect and Fallout and all these other RPG games where choices matter up until the third game.
Well, and specifically the ending.
Yeah. When there's literally a scene in Mass Effect 3 where you are choosing between keeping one character alive or another. One character is more likable than the other one, but the other one will give you more ships for your fleet. Which one do you kill? And that's not even, like, they're not even talking about the whole ends justifying the means. That's your mind asking which one is more important to me that I will not...
Asking questions of the reader or the person playing the game or the audience watching is one way to integrate philosophy, and by showing a choice, you're not necessarily stating, well, do you want to go with the person you like or the better, financial option? I mean, you're not specifically stating that. You're just showing the decision process being made. And people will automatically jump to certain philosophies, whether they know it or not.
Which is why I'm going to use Batman and Superman as an example. Batman has to, like in the Batman Arkham games, Batman has to worry about saving as many lives as possible. And he has to make the choices about whether or not a villain's life is more important than a police officer's life, and he has to find a way around that. In the Red Hood, he ends up having to figure out how to save Red Hood without killing the Red Hood. And he basically ends up making another option, or another better example is Batman. In Arkham Origins, the Joker hooks himself up to a heart monitor to Bane's heart monitor that will kill him. With every pump of Bane's heart, the charger charges more. And the only way for Batman to save the Joker is to kill Bane. And so Batman takes a different option by stopping Bane's heart and then restarting it after the Joker leaves. And it's just that, but with Superman does not really have the problem of who do I save, because he can save both of them. The questions and problems Superman faces are mostly, how do I cope with using my powers and not killing someone? And also, how do I stop myself from becoming a god? And those are all valid questions that you can have in your stories, and those are also God complexes and other things like that are things you can have in your story without actually stating it. There was a story where Princess Luna, when she becomes Nightmare Moon, gets a God complex, but you don't know that because they build it up. They built up her going from wanting to rule Equestria to wanting to rule the world to wanting to rule the Omniverse. And that's just how you do it. And a lot of these questions tie into how do you make your character. Because depending on how you make your character, that's when the philosophies will be. Rainbow Dash is loyal to can be loyal to a fault because that's her personal belief. While someone more like Applejack doesn't need to be loyal to a fault because it doesn't fit with her paradigm of honesty. Because you don't need to be loyal to be honest. So there are times when you're honest and you'll basically end up hurting your friends, and you're not loyal to them by doing that, because when you're a friend, you're generally not supposed to hurt your friends, but it's inevitably going to happen.
If you want to talk about a real mind bend about philosophy, My Little Pony actually has there's a interesting view where it's the elements of harmony, the loyalty, honesty, laughter. It's that they actually are encouraging these things. It's not just that they're a perfect representation in and of themselves, which is why they keep getting challenged. And you'll notice for a lot of the characters, in season 4, when they fulfill, overcoming a challenge to their element, it usually involves another pony, and it's usually not just them fulfilling their element, it's causing others to fulfill their element as well. It's usually the item given by the other character that really shows the end to the arc. So, ironically, it has this philosophy of being an element means encouraging this in others, not just being a representative yourself. And because of that, it's a very subtle philosophical point that people have discussed on and off with the elements in that show.
And there was another, in the fandom, there was a story, I keep forgetting the names of these because I've read them a long time ago, but one of them was basically where, and I cited this when I did my lecture on gods, where Celestia, Luna, and Discord all represent a idea. They represent harmony, chaos, and balance. But the issue is since they aren't the idea, since they aren't a force of nature, they are physical embodiments of the idea. They aren't perfect. They don't do their job perfectly. They do the job as they interpret their job. So Celestia's interpretation of being harmony is to enforce harmony on everything and not let chaos do anything. And Discord's interpretation of chaos is to cause destruction and mischief, even though chaos is change. And Luna's idea of enforcing balance is dethroning Discord, letting Celestia reign, and dethroning Celestia, and then letting Discord reign. That is her idea of it, even though that is not what balance is. And
that goes back to the point we were making, where it's each character, their motivations, their interpretations, and how it reflects on the world. Let's probably wrap it up. I'll actually probably cut that last.
I'm getting hungry. I talk
portion off
weirdly.
Yeah.
Do you want to give them some resources that they can use to better their writing if we're talking
about just one, if there's any one resource for people to better their writing, going back to Brandon Mull, he is part of a large podcast on writing called Writing Excuses, which is they aim to be 15 minutes long. They usually get a guest person in, but they have about 10 seasons of stories from professional authors, and from authors who right before they made professional, and one of their people used to be in later seasons used to be a puppet, like that their profession was being a puppeteer. So, and another one is a cartoon artist, like a comic book artist who does stuff online. So they have a lot of different perspectives. They get along well. They try to record all their stuff in the same room, which is a lot nicer than us doing it over Skype. But Writing Excuses is probably the number one place I would send people to, because they will also point people towards other things. You can search by each podcast, asks a specific question or covers a specific topic.
At least website-wise, if you don't want to sit through podcasts, Fanfiction's FAQ has a lot of useful stuff about it, especially the guide to writing. And also, the School for New Writers, obviously, but that's what we're doing this for. The one that really helped my writing a lot, and I don't write that often anymore, I'm trying to get back into the swing of things, is joining a writing club in any school function, especially in college, especially if it's fiction writing, or if joining any forum based around writing.
Anytime we're discussing and trying to share with others.
Where you share with others. That's why Fanfiction is such a great thing. You can join groups of other writers and get together, or just make friends with a bunch of different writers and make a Skype group like the Teacher's Lounge. And then also TV tropes. Even though a lot of people don't like TV tropes has helped my writing a lot. It's helped me understand the tropes that are used in a lot of writing, and it also helped me find things for writing like Sanders' rules for magic and other things that I never would have known about if I was just browsing the internet.
It's a great way to learn about something new because it tends to be very concise. It gives good examples, and it also tends to link things together. So if it's not just, about, this cliche, it's about this cliche, which is also part of this larger writing mechanic in this other way, and so it's this kind of combination of two stuff. So it gives good detail, it gives good jumping off points, and gives a good basics for any specific concept.
A few other references, even if you're not religious text does help. It does give you a very good idea of how to write a story. Even if you aren't religious, the Bible is a very good story. The Quran, all of the Hindu texts, they all help you become a better writer. They give you new words, they give you new ideas. And also, my one tip to you is don't write science fiction. The main reason is because science fiction, when you're a new writer, is hard to do. The scale that you have to write a science fiction universe is incredibly hard. Start small.
It depends on the type of story you're writing. If you're writing a first-person